Hi, I'm Jesse and welcome to the Cinema 4D tutorial. Today we will be focused on creating lights. This is a follow-up to my light theory tutorial. So before we get started, let's create a scene out of a floor, and I'm going to use a sphere. This will act as our subject for the lighting. Now before I actually light this scene, I want you to notice that the scene is already lit. That's because the camera that we're using to view everything in Cinema 4D has its own built-in light. And that light basically is there so that you can see, no matter what angle you are at, you can see whatever you're working on. Now, the moment I add a light though, that built-in camera light will go away and we won't have to worry about that. So there are two ways that you can add a light. One is to go up in this Create menu, find the light, and click on Light. The other one is to click on this object right here that looks like a light. It's pretty obvious. And this icon's existed in multiple previous versions of Cinema 4D, while the Create menu hasn't. So I recommend always using that. It's also the lazy option, and it saves more time. So without further ado, I'm going to click on this light. And you'll notice the entire scene goes black. That's because the light is at the origin, which is technically inside the floor and inside the sphere, even though the floor doesn't have a thickness. Now, don't worry about that, just drag the light outwards and you'll notice right away that it starts lighting the scene. I'm going to drag it up and slightly to the side. Now you notice I omitted one little bit of information. That's the light icon has a little down arrow. If you click and hold, you'll notice that there are multiple different types of light. And now you're wondering, why am I not showing you all these other types of lights? That's because most of these are accessible within this light object, and you will see that in a moment. So now that we have a light, let's just quickly render the scene, Command R, or this icon right here. And you'll notice that the scene is lit. You can tell that there's some kind of glare here and on the sphere. The back of the sphere is dark and there's no shadow. Now I'm going to select the light and we can start working with it. You control the light entirely in the Attributes Manager. So for starters, let's note that here's a color. Select the color and it changes the light color. That's pretty obvious. I'm going to switch it back to white because white light's just easier for this demonstration. Next tab is intensity. Intensity is how bright the light is. So do you want it to be very, very dim, about 50%, or completely lit up? This is useful if you have multiple lights in your scene, because if you have a lot of lights and they're all at 100% and they're all very close to each other, your scene might start becoming washed out. So you might want to turn them all down to 50%, and with maybe 5 or so lights, that'll be bright enough. I'll leave it at 100% so you can see everything very clearly. Now for the type of light. You'll notice that here it says Omni. That's because what we have is a point light. A point light is a point and it emits light in every possible direction, every possible angle, as you can pretty much tell from my render previously. Now if I select this tab, I have multiple different choices to pick from. You'll notice these kind of look familiar. That's because they're the same ones and more than what's right here. That's why we don't really have to worry about this other stuff. Nevertheless, I will focus only on these top 4. These are your most used light sources. So we already see what the Omni is. Now let's look at the spotlight. I select that, and what you can guess is it becomes a spotlight. And the spotlight is within this circle. And as you notice, the circle isn't actually shining onto the object. So to make it shine on the objects, I'll have to rotate it downwards. And you'll notice right away the spotlight appears. You'll also see that there are these little orange dots on the circle and inside. On the inside controls how far out it goes. And on the circle controls how wide of a spotlight you want. It's pretty self-explanatory. The next selection is infinite light. The moment I click this, the circle disappears, but this line stays. The line tells you what direction the infinite light points. So if I rotate this, you'll notice the rotation of the infinite light changes. You can think of this as a sun object. It's basically infinitely far away in the sky, and it lights everything in your scene. Your next choice is the area light. This is very similar to the Omni light, except if I render this, you'll notice there's a little kind of black line here. That's because what it is an area light. As you can see, there's a square around it, and that's kind of the area of the light. That square is the light source. Now I'm going to switch it back to Omni. And you have noticed probably by now that there's no actual shadow. The light's shining on the sphere. This half of the sphere is dark. Oops, it unrendered for me. But this area behind it, and it keeps unrendering for me, I don't know why, the area behind the sphere isn't dark, isn't in shadow. That's because obviously our shadow, we have none selected, so there's no actual shadow. So once you select the shadow, you'll notice that 3 types to choose from: shadow maps, ray traced, and area. I'll start at the top. Shadow maps is a soft lighting, so if I render this, you'll notice it has hard edges, but a soft end. Ray traced lighting is entirely hard. This is very unrealistic, as you can probably tell, but it's the quickest to render. It takes the least processing processing time to render from all of them. So if you have a very busy scene, you can switch your shadow types to ray traced to test render things out because it'll take the least time. Finally, we have area. This takes the most time and is the most realistic. So once I render that, you'll notice it takes maybe half a second longer, but the actual umbra is much smaller and the shadow peters out much more realistically than the other 2 types. So I'm going to leave that at area. Our next choice is visible light. Right now it's none, you can't actually see the light. The 3 types to choose from, and I'll focus right now on visible because as of yet there's no difference between visible and volumetric from what you can just tell straight off the bat. So I'll select visible and you'll notice that it creates a kind of skeleton sphere around it. This is the distance out away from the sphere that we have visible light. So I'm just going to leave it around there and render the scene. And you'll notice that the light becomes visible. But it's very constant. It kind of looks like fog, but it isn't exactly fog. But we can make it fog. Go to the Noise tab in Attributes menu. And right now it's at none. Select Visibility. And now, if you render it, you'll have fog that has inconsistencies. It's changed by the soft turbulence. You can change the type. You can have pure noise. And if I render that, you'll notice it's kind of very similar. It has inconsistencies, makes it look like thicker parts of fog, lighter parts of fog. I'm going to switch that back to soft turbulence. And if I turn off visible light and render it now, with the noise still on visibility, you won't see anything. That's because visible light is off. But if I switch noise to illumination, this is kind of a cool thing, kind of spooky, and render it now, the noise is cast onto the objects, as if your light is being shown through some filter of some sort. And it's kind of a creepy effect, kind of cool. You probably won't be using it all that often. But that's the basics of lighting. Now, I'm going to post another tutorial shortly after this one, which will cover realistic lighting, and I will also introduce kind of second way, apart from this light object, a second way of creating light in Cinema 4D. Thank you for watching.